Oh, good evening, everybody. Welcome into this edition of Unidentified History here on the Attitude of Aggression. I guess you can call it a network now, kind of, sort of. Anyway, I am your host tonight, Dave Unger, coming to you here. Wanted to get this episode out sooner rather than later because what we're going to be talking about here tonight is this is going to be a recap of this weekend's phenomenal event, the UAP Summit that took place virtually, hosted by the Human Institute, Reed Summers, Rich Hoffman. They all put on a tremendous event this weekend that had, I believe, 14 panels of just some huge heavy hitters in the industry. Reed did a tremendous job putting this event together. And we're going to recap that here tonight. I might be one of the first ones out of the gate to really talk about this in detail. So, yay me, sort of. But it was a great event. It really was. And we're going to get into all the details. I'll kind of give you the background of what I did to put this thing together. I got kind of the idea for this a little bit. I will give her full credit. Suzanne Landers, she's an attorney like me. And at the Soul Foundation event in Italy, I think it was back in October or something like that. Suzanne went over there and she took 85 pages of notes. And for those of you who know who Suzanne is, she's a more often than not a co-host on Somewhere in the Skies, which is Ryan Sprague's. Yeah, 2 long days worth. Whistling Mike is on here. It was long, but it was very informative and really good. And hopefully we won't spend 2 days here tonight. I don't plan on doing that. But it was Suzanne she's more often than not Ryan's co-host on Somewhere in the Sky. So I was kind of kidding around with her when the whole thing started because a couple of things I did about the event that kind of came in handy was I watched it on my phone. And this was like, in some respects, it was cool. In some respects, not so much because you don't have the bigger screen. But where it came in really handy was I was able to take screenshots of the slides as they were going on and was able to go back and reference those slides as I went along. And what I started to do, I just started to type notes on my computer. So I'm watching on the phone, typing notes on the computer. And I didn't come up with 85 pages, but I think when I got to 8 pages of notes, I messaged Suzanne and I said, trying to live up to your standards here. And it ended up I know she got tied up with stuff this weekend, so is going to catch a lot of this on replay. So I kind of feel like I'm the custodian of the record here for the UAP Summit. So when this episode comes out officially, I'm going to make all my notes. I'm going to download it. I will make all of it available. And man, it does come out to 14 pages of typewritten notes. And when I do put the episode out, I'm going to download that document like I do with when we do the historical deep dives in the documents I create. So those of you who've ever read that know that when I actually do start writing, it's usually very detailed, and you're going to get that. And when the episode comes out, you guys have my express permission to use the document however you want, use any of the information you want, type it, copy, paste it, burn it if you want to. I don't care, but have at it. Hopefully it'll help you guys in some way. So that will be made available when I do officially put this episode up. What will not be available, though, is although I did take pictures of the slides, I'm not going to post those for some pretty obvious reasons. I don't have the permission of any of the presenters to present that or to post those pictures. I don't know if they care or not, and I'm not going to take that chance. I will respect the fact that I don't know any better. I believe Reed had indicated that the conference and the events will be going up on the YouTube channel eventually. I'm not sure when, but I certainly would urge anybody, if you didn't attend the event live and you can still buy a virtual pass to get it, it is well worth. I think I paid $50 for it. I know a lot of people were paying 75, but then everybody was offering discount codes. UFO Podcast was offering something, Somewhere in the Skies. A bunch of people were offering discount codes. And by all means, it is easily worth your $50. And hopefully what this episode will do is it will kind of give you an idea of what was discussed on the panels. I'm going to be talking about the highlights of the panels, big takeaways I took from the panels. I will be covering all of the panels and kind of just giving you an overview. It's not going to be like a blow for blow, play for play sort of thing. It's just going to be the stuff I picked out, the highlights that I thought were important. And you guys can go from there and decide what sounds good, what panels you may want to watch, which ones you might want to skip, that sort of thing. So that's kind of the goal here tonight, is to give a recap and a rundown of this really awesome event that is and the overarching theme of the UAP Summit was really a shift from this notion of government disclosure, like Matthew Brown talked about months ago, saying, deep state disclosure is dead. And this summit really kind of steers into that and shifts the focus to civilian disclosure, civilian scientists. I'll even go so far as to say it is a focus on civilian scientists and what they can do as far as, pushing this all forward and making a much bigger sort of effort to discover this stuff on your own and that sort of thing. So that's what we're going to be doing here tonight. And I hope you guys enjoy this. I did mention in the post, I will be playing at the end of this episode. We will be doing the Super Bowl big game spot. I don't know. The Super Bowl's done. I guess I can say Super Bowl, and the NFL doesn't care. And if they do, oh well. But they had the big game spot that went on. And we got a new Disclosure Day trailer. And then we got a little blurb from Steven Spielberg that got people talking today. And I know one of the people who was contemplating it was one of the guys watching right now, whistling by, thinking about full disclosure to the whole world at once. Sounds kind of like a good idea, but it's probably not an application. But anyway, before we get to the UAP Summit, I did want to take a brief moment to talk about, it was an event that took place Friday before the summit took place. And it was a little event, and it was put on by IONS, the Noetic Institute. And it was this thing that was hosted by Tom Matty, I think I pronounced his name right, and Kelly Chase. And those of us in the community, we all know who Kelly Chase is. And Tom was talking about this concept. I'm going to see if I can't share the screen here so that I can show you kind of the idea of what this is. Somewhere in here. Let me find it. Got it. There we go. It only takes me 20 years to figure this stuff out. So, okay. This thing that they hosted, the 8 stages of upsight vision. This is a download from Tom Matty's website that you can get for free. It's a free download. And this was a really cool event to attend, because what it was Tom was like, and Tom's story, and you guys, I'll put all the links in the description when the episode actually comes out. But I just kind of wanted to show this whole thing, Tom Matty, the 8 stages of upside vision. And you may be saying, okay, what is upside vision, Dave? Why don't you explain this to me? Okay, funny you should ask. So the thing about upside vision is that when you get this document and you read what Tom was talking about, and he was a successful marketing executive. He was a business owner. He was a husband, father over in Atlanta. And then he got addicted to cocaine. And obviously that really screws up a lot of things. So this cocaine addiction he had led to some mental illness. He was in a psychiatric hospital. He was homeless for like a period of 2 years. He was lost and really out of it, like to the point that true mental illness. His brain, the drugs had an impact on his brain, but not in the way that you would expect. Like, he didn't get brain damage or anything like this. When he eventually came out of this drug, this stupor, and he broke free of the cocaine addiction, he'd acquired this interesting ability to see holographic images that were all around him. And it was like, not only could he see them, but he could interact with them as well. And he's been working with this thing that he calls upsight vision since 2012. And I think he's got a peer-reviewed paper coming out, and he worked with Dr. Dean Radin, who a lot of us have heard of Dr. Dean Radin and the work that he's done. And so this is all peer-reviewed that's coming out. So they've researched all this stuff. And just generally, upside vision, the definition he provides in the glossary of this document is the ability to see and interact with holographic images that are everywhere around us. It sounds like a DMT or a psychedelic acid trip or something like that, but the way that Tom describes it, it's really not that at all. And I don't want to get too deep into it, other than because I think people should, go download the document, do their own research. There's some stuff on YouTube that you can watch about this. It was a really fascinating event, and Kelly jumped in as well, and she talked about her own experiences, and those of us familiar with Kelly kind of know her story and where that started, and how she had her own experiences with psychedelics that led to her kind of going down the proverbial UFO rabbit hole, which coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, was the title of her podcast before it turned into Cosmosis. So I just wanted to touch bases on that real quick before we jumped into the summit, because I thought it was a very worthwhile conference to attend, and you can't really call it a conference, just an event to attend to learn something more on the consciousness side of things, because the summit really didn't deal with much in the way of consciousness. It was really not about that. It's very scientifically based and science heavy. So I did want to give out a shout out to Tom Maddie and to Kelly Chase for that awesome event that was on Friday that kind of maybe flew under the radar a little bit. So it was pretty cool to see that. Let's get into the summit. And like I said, there is, 15 pages of notes on this damn thing. So I really tried to do this with the idea that I wanted to impart to anybody who was listening to this episode just the main points of the summit, the cool aspects of things, just the stuff that stood out to me as being truly like the stuff I took away that I thought was important. And, there may be mistakes in here. I'm typing as I'm listening to these guys and I'm trying to take in what they're saying, and I'm grasping the essence of the conference. So if I make a mistake, please be gentle. Don't, beat me up too bad. So I did the best I could. But anyway, let's get into it. So day one, the very first thing that we went to, or the very first panel, I should say, that we got into was it ended up being, get in here. Okay, there we go. Nope, that didn't work. There it is. Okay. So the very first thing we got into, the first panel it was Reed Summers and Rich Hoffman, and they gave their opening remarks. And the purpose of the summit was to develop and advance technologies to effectively track and identify UAP, with a focus being on data rather than anecdotal evidence. And this is, of course, stuff that we've all, we'll see how our lists match up here, Mike. Mine maybe a little bit more detailed, attorney, it's going to kind of go that way. But anyway, we'll see how things work along here. And what we kind of came up with as we go along here. But the big thing that they wanted to get away from the anecdotal evidence, which is something we've all talked about. There's and this is of course a clear desire to address the skeptics' biggest complaint that we've heard all the time. Where's the data? Where's the hard, indisputable evidence? How do we improve our detection and tracking strategies in coordination to address and perhaps solve this very valid criticism? It is a valid criticism, and it's a valid problem, whatever you want to think about it. There's big issues, though, regarding what we already know. UFOs are real. Evidence does exist. This is a global phenomenon. There might now be 6 observables. We've always talked about 5 observables, but that's kind of morphed into 6. Data and information are not being shared enough among researchers. The phenomenon, of course, remains elusive, so data collection is very hit and miss. So that was kind of the takeaways I got from Reed and Rich's opening remarks. From there, we jumped right into the first panel, which was involving Matt Ford from the Good Trouble Show and Representative Eric Burleson. What I took away from this is Matt was really pressing for Department of Homeland Security to become more involved in investigating the phenomenon. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that in a panel coming up not too far from here. Representative Burleson indicated the compartmentalization problem, which we've all talked about numerous times with various government departments. He was talking like some departments are acting as though they're protecting their turf. And I'm quoting him, turf. This certainly doesn't help, but I'm like listening to turf. I'm like, this is not West Side Story. Why are we protecting our turf? But they get so dug in with each department saying this is our domain. This is our province. Representative Burleson was certainly kind of steering into that skid as we went along here. Burleson discussed how commercial pilots still are not reporting incidents enough, likely due to the persistent stigma that exists. He discussed ongoing incursions into military installations. He even mentioned a video. We did not see this video. There was a bit of video here and there that we saw during the summit, but it did not happen here. But he mentioned a video that he saw of 3 objects operating in close proximity to military assets / aircraft. And of course, this creates an airspace safety issue. Representative Burleson noted that our systems are configured to detect adversarial assets, not UAP, which is a problem. You're going to hear this multiple times during the course of this summit. So you've got that stuff going on. He discussed the UAPDA and the ongoing effort there. It's not dead. He notes that this year was more a case of them running out of time than that of other issues. He does recognize eminent domain is likely going to remain a sticking point. He indicated Danny Sheehan is helping them to refine some of that language. They need to, because as long as that eminent domain is in there, my legal opinion is that's going to be a problem. And for multiple reasons, because it's like a mandatory eminent domain provision the way it reads right now. There's no discretion on the review board to consider a different option. The way it reads is like you got to go and grab this stuff, which of course is going to be a big problem. Never mind, eminent domain requires you to provide adequate compensation to the party from whom you are taking this stuff. So how do you put a price tag on anti-gravitic tech that supposedly doesn't exist? Don't know, but something to think about. Representative Burleson believes 3 to 6% of Congress is actively engaged in this issue, which is shockingly low. But many people do express varying levels of curiosity, and it remains a bipartisan issue. So that's good news. So it appears the effort to pass the UAPDA will continue. Representative Burleson still believes that President Trump could be the disclosure president, citing his extreme dislike of the deep state. But this is the big part. He indicates that this issue is not in Trump's windshield, and it needs to be more pressing to prompt him to act and make an announcement that's going to reverberate basically for all of history. And that's one of the bigger issues that with this whole thing is that let me put this up on the screen. Yeah, Burleson said some interesting stuff, saying DHS may want to press charges on drones and things. It did get serious really quick. There's something here, but to get back on this thing, it's like what Burleson is saying, and I almost wanted Matt to ask. I wanted Matt to ask Burleson, have you heard anything about this alleged disclosure speech that Trump's supposed to put out there on July 8th or something like that, on the anniversary of Roswell? But Matt didn't go there, and that's fine. It seems ludicrous on its face. The big takeaways here on this issue are that you've got the UAPDA still being worked on. Representative Burleson has not abandoned all hope there. He does still believe Trump might be the disclosure president, but we've all talked about this online, that even if he says, hey, we're not alone, here's what's going on with everything else going on right now with Epstein and all that shit, is anybody going to believe him? And that's a big problem. So it was a good way to start the summit, I thought. And it before you could jump straight into all the heavy science, we got into something that's more familiar with people who are just tuning in, right? If you're just jumping on the first panel and you see people you're familiar with, oh, there's Matt Ford, there's Representative Burleson, I know these guys, let's see what they have to say. That would continue with the second panel, which was somebody that many of us are familiar with, and that's Richard Dolan. And much of what Richard said, they're facts and points that are discussed in his phenomenal book, The History of USOs, Volume 1. Now, Volume 2 is supposed to come out any day now or any week now, according to what Richard was saying. But, there is a definite, I don't know about a shift, but people are taking the USO issue much more seriously. And Richard Dolan's book is just one aspect of that. But he discussed the USO issue, reported findings of 700 cases he considered reliable enough to discuss, which is interesting. He said it's far below the reporting levels for aerial events. So 700 seems like a lot. There's probably more than that, but he just didn't find them credible. And if you've read Richard's book, Volume 1, you'll kind of realize the vetting process that he went through to get to those 700 numbers. That's kind of, he kind of goes into a little bit of that. But I would say, obviously, really seriously read Richard's book. It's phenomenal. He does a great job, and it really digs deeper into this whole USO issue. Some of the more interesting facts involve a massive shift in USO sightings going to predominantly nighttime since 1968. 74% of USO sightings since 1968 have been at night. Many of these reports are tied to naval operations. The phenomenon is still predominantly avoiding direct contact, with only 36% of cases showing a potential interest in witnesses. In our chaotic world right now, the question remains, how effectively can we deal with them? Who knows? Richard emphasizes we should focus more on the phenomenon's behavior rather than on its identity. It's interesting. taxonomy of USOs is very similar to that of UFOs, suggesting that we're not dealing with distinct species operating, some in the skies versus the seas. It could very well be the same beings or species that are operating in a transmedium fashion. Electromagnetic interference cases are significantly higher with military vessels than with other types of vehicles. Similar conclusions can be drawn regarding interference with weapon systems on military vessels. So, like I said, a lot of it is in Richard's book. He does go into detail. It is interesting to note the shift since 1968. I'm not sure. I mean, other than the year I was born, yes, I just outed my age. Sorry, but that's all it is. I don't know what happened in 68 to really shift this to a more nighttime sort of basis, although it does certainly seem like the phenomenon or whatever we're dealing with is trying to be more clandestine and maybe not so overt. Whatever we're dealing with, whether it's, NHI, black tech, both, neither, that sort of thing. There is a shift as far as like this wanting to go to the nighttime sort of aspects of things and getting away from being so overt and out there, even though that has failed largely because these things are still being seen all over the place. So that's not the end of Richard. We will see Richard many more times. He acts as a moderator on a lot of these panels as we're going forward and that sort of thing. The next panel is a really interesting one, and this kind of ties into the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security stuff we were talking about earlier. It's Keith Taylor, Ted Rowe, and Monica Alnez Nicholas. And this was a really interesting discussion about the history of law enforcement interactions with UAP, which, when you hear that, you're thinking, what? There's more to this than you would think. There's more meat on the bone here than you would think. Taylor discussed that there's definitely a disconnect that might be very deliberate between what local law enforcement reports and how the feds are they'll get this report, they'll either disregard the event out of course, they'll obfuscate the entire situation, or they'll just flat out show disinterest in whatever has transpired. Roswell is, of course, the most public example of this, but there's other cases such as Stephenville, the New Jersey drone incursions. These all demonstrate the same issue to such an extent that New Jersey has now enacted laws to address it. So, Keith is talking about this issue where you've got local law enforcement. There's like even that well-publicized case of the Connecticut police officer who saw this stuff and was trying to escape the scene in reverse. And I hear people, why weren't you taking pictures? Yeah, you take pictures while you're driving in reverse at 50 miles an hour to get the hell away from something. Let me know how that works for you. But anyway, there is this, the feds are going to come in, and once they get a hold of the situation, the disinformation begins, the obfuscation begins, the denial begins. And that was a big point of what Keith Taylor was talking about here. Ted Rowe discussed the ongoing stigma surrounding this topic, especially as far as discouraging commercial pilots from reporting these events to the FAA. This ties into what Eric Burleson discussed earlier. This is going to tie directly into something we're about to discuss in the next panel. Monica then discussed this ongoing issue of UAS versus UAP, drones versus something potentially else, and the issues that this presents, particularly the challenges for local law enforcement in addressing a wide range of situations. And the examples that they used were like a hobbyist drone crashing into a park creates an issue, but one that can be relatively more or less easily dealt with. And then you've got something more serious and potentially dangerous that local law enforcement may see that they're not equipped to deal with right now. Keith emphasized greater involvement by Homeland Security would be key, potentially through the Homeland Security Information Network. He also emphasized that the 6 observables that we're dealing with can create challenges for local law enforcement when addressing these issues. Ted emphasized that medical and psychological treatment for those who need it following an extraordinary encounter with UAP must be provided. That's becoming a bigger issue. The biological effects, that 6th observable that has now come to the forefront, you need to take that more seriously. And that was one of the things that Ted had stressed here. Ultimately, with UAS becoming more prevalent, there's got to be better coordination between citizens and first responders, along with considering UAP as part of this whole drone framework. So it's not just an issue of accurate reporting and law enforcement, but you've got to take into consideration the safety and wellness of observers and experiencers alike. And I think that was really poignant and important. Yeah. Well, I'll put this up here for Mike, put this up here. If Langley Air Force Base can't deal with advanced drones, how would local law enforcement have a shot in hell? No chance. That's my opinion, no chance. I do think that the general aspect of what they're talking about here, when you get some of these events that may not be, advanced drone stuff that's going on at Langley or whatever is happening in New Jersey or Denmark, that's certainly a different spectrum. We're in a different sort of place right there. But some of these other issues that somebody's may have something crash in a park. That could be a hobbyist drone, could be something a little bit more advanced. If one of these more advanced drones was to fail and crash somewhere, how would local law enforcement deal with that? What is the protocol for dealing with something like if you had something that was, that was more advanced? How would you address that? And what would be the protocol for local law enforcement? Who would they call? What would they do? And the other thing that was kind of flying under the radar here was, what about any sort of biological, physical, psychological effects that might happen to people who, I won't say stumble upon these things, but if there is an event that happens somewhere and a UAS goes down, and the first responders are going to be the local guys more than likely. I mean, I guess you could have the feds tracking this thing and be there, but yeah, I do think like Mike's saying, if it is an advanced drone, local law enforcement's not going to really have a chance to deal with that, or is not going to know how to do it. But I think with UAS becoming more prevalent, like they were talking about, the chances of this sort of encounter increasing, where first responders or local guys are going to be confronted with this, what the hell is this in front of me situation? What is this crap leaking out of it? Is this toxic? Is this radioactive? I do think that has to be taken into consideration, and that's where Homeland Security, they need to be more involved in this process. So I do agree with Dr. Taylor, and I think he's a doctor, and like what Representative Burleson is saying, and all these guys. It's all fascinating and interesting stuff. Let's move on to the next panel, which was Ryan Graves, who many of us know. Michael Lembeck, Adam Yingling was the moderator for this. Ryan, we know from the Americans for Safe Aerospace Act and a lot of the work that he's done there. And of course, testified before Congress in 2023. Ryan recounted a stunning account of a 737 departing, I believe he said South Africa, that came within 200 feet of a large black triangle. This thing actually got up on the nose, within 200 feet of the nose of this thing. The triangle could be seen with the naked eye, but here's the kicker. It was invisible to radar, which is kind of like, as we'll go along, the reverse of a lot of this stuff you see where you can't see these things, but instrumentation is picking this up. But this is the opposite. They could see the triangle with the naked eye. It's invisible to radar. Ryan talked about the stigma still existing against reporting these incidents is so strong that the flight crew of this plane, they self-administered drug tests to make sure they had not been drugged. That's how strong the fucking stigma is here, that these guys saw this thing and said, somebody slipped us some acid or something. We need to drug test ourselves. The flight chief was concerned about this incident because his wife was on the flight, but nothing beyond expressing that concern was ever done about this. Listen to that stuff. It's insane. I mean, the stigma is so strong that people are self-administering drug tests, and my wife was on the plane. That really sucks. All right, on to the next thing. Anyway, it's pretty mind-numbing. But Ryan continues to press the issue of aerospace safety and to give pilots a safe space where they feel they can report these events. Michael Lembeck then came on. He discussed the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, the charter. It is at AIAUAP.org. I'll try and make sure that we can get the addresses all in here. The Hardware Factor Subcommittee is developing a multimodal detection system designed to sit with cloud computing on the edge of the cloud. Interesting, they've been working with the Tedescos, who we'll hear from later on some citizen-based science projects for open source sharing. And I think this was the first time in the summit where this recurrent theme would come up: citizen-based science projects, open source sharing. Remember this becomes a recurrent theme during this conference. Michael provides examples of sensor systems that can be purchased typically for less than $1,000 off the shelf and set up in a backyard for detection and tracking. Okay, That's not affordable for most Americans, but it's not completely out of the realm of like, it's not 25,000 like some of the stuff we'll see later on. They have developed software designed to identify more prosaic explanations, such as birds, satellites, or planes. Then he discusses a portable and environmental anomaly tracker that can be put together for less than $150. So it's basically like you get all the different components of this thing, you can put it together or for yourself. It's like less than 150. And now that's much more affordable for citizen science. Remote deployments are underway in Huntsville, Alabama. They're soon going to be doing something in, I believe, Mount Rainier, Washington. Bill DePaula, and this was the fun part. I'm going to give some information because this is very interesting. Bill DePaula has developed a UAP detector that appears to integrate a wide range of detection considerations, including gamma ray detection, GPS, that famous 1.7 gigahertz electromagnetic detector. Anybody who's watched Skinwalker Ranch has seen the 1.7 gigahertz wavelength and the frequency. This thing's got UV, time dilation, all of this built into it. They want to develop a parts list over the next few months so people can build these themselves. Now, here's the fun part. This UAP detector was already available on Amazon for $275. I say was because as this is going on, a bunch of us started to go over to Amazon to look for this thing, and we found it. And it was right there available, $275. There were 7 of them available when this event started. I was over in Pavel Ibarra's chat in his Discord, and I posted a link to this thing over there. By the time this first day, I think by the time the next panel is done, they're all gone. People went and they bought they sold out. I mean, granted, only 7 of them. But by the time this was done, for $275, all 7 of them were gone. Now, all the indications are they're going to get more in there. And of course, when you sell out that fast, somebody's going to be letting Bill know, hey, you sold out of all these things. Maybe they'll get on. Yeah, let me put this on here. Dude, I was, yeah, Mike, I was shocked and I was too, man. When I saw it, I thought, gosh, I thought about grabbing one and I said, I'll come back to it later, and see what's going on. Never got a chance because people just jumped on there, gobbled this thing up. It's really cool. Like the specs that I just gave, and yeah, you could put your own stuff together. You can put your, hodgepodge, your own thing together, rig your own thing together. But it's cool. It's like you can go on there, and even though it's sold out, you can go to Amazon and check out this UAP detector. And maybe I'll even put a link of it when the episode comes out. But you can go there and look at it. It looks like a video game controller or remote control, like anybody using the RF cars or anything like that. It just looks like one of these little things. So everything's built into this. It's very handheld. It's very convenient. It's not all clunky and cumbersome. I think there's an indication that they're going to get more of these out there, probably at a lower price point, but we'll see. But yeah, this was the cool story that I sent a tweet to Reed earlier today that people are interested in this stuff. This was the biggest example from the entire weekend of just how much people on the citizen side of things, they want to get out there and they want to help. They want to do what they can to detect UAP, to track this stuff. They just don't know how. And the price point has been a major barrier for anybody wanting to get involved with this. And stuff like this, you see, yeah, $275 is a little bit pricey for most people. I get that. I'm not begrudging anybody that, but it's not unreasonable. I mean, tickets for WrestleMania this year cost double that. So take that into consideration and context that for $275, you can have in the palm of your hand stuff that you may be able to detect something that your eyes can't see, unlike the black triangle that Ryan talked about. So that was a really cool aspect of things. We're going to see many more examples of the citizen science push as we go along here. Ryan has spoken with the FAA and NASA about these aerospace safety issues, but there has been no specific mandate to act, and they're unlikely to take action, which is why the Americans for Safe Aerospace Act is so important. Ryan does not believe commercial pilots have the right cockpit tools to make accurate determinations about the size, shape, and distance of UAPs. He thinks total sightings remain massively underreported. And then on the other side of the fence, Starlink has, of course, generated numerous false sightings. Anybody who's watched the Starlink launch, you guys all know that. We've seen all that stuff happen. So that was that panel. Let's move on to the next one. Rich Hoffman moderated this interesting, what's this up here? Yeah, when you get to the talk at the end and the prices, James mentioned this 275 was a good product to list. It really was. I mean, there's some it's a really great product for a very affordable price. I'd say that, I mean, I know people say, well, 275 is it's kind of high, but it's when you think about what's under the hood there, it's not bad at all. Let me get back into this here and see where we were. So we've got Rich Hoffman hosting this panel with Roni Vernay. Many of us know Roni from his work in Brazil. Richard Hopf and Ronald Olch. I'm not sure I pronounced that right. Sorry, trying. But anyway, this is more of the citizen science stuff and kind of showing more of the way to get into this. Richard Hopf was talking about Sky 360. This is a global tracking network. We have no idea about the intent of UAP or the source of it. Of course, lots of people want to say, oh, everybody's got a smartphone and you can use that and do all this sort of stuff. Well, there's various issues with smartphone data, such as, of course, the blurry photos, the lack of provenance, those sort of things. Another big problem is that the UAP research, it's not reproducible usually. And of course, anybody who's looking at this from the scientific standpoint knows we need to reproduce this stuff. Open source data is being stressed, and its stewardship is the key. Richard believed they would need a network of about 150,000 nodes to be effective, and citizen scientists would need to be the key to pulling this off. Citizen scientists, of course, they're not concerned with their return on investment. They can finance, build, and maintain their own station. And Richard thought this would likely be less than a $5,000 venture. So again, price is its entry. It is a barrier. It's not as bad as it has been. That's still a pretty big ticket for a lot of people to handle. I get that. But he does stress that open source would establish the trusted provenance here, helping to address broader like fraud issues and things like that. There's edge computing, standardized data storage and collection are also critical. Ronald Olch, I think that's it, came on, and then he discussed UFO DAP, which is another citizen science network that provides citizen scientists with advanced data collection software and hardware. Ronald noted the previously identified issues with UFO data collection, and he notes that UAP understanding will advance by eliminating these issues through the automated collection of real-time UAP event data. UFODAP.com is a website where users can purchase the software that these guys are using. They can also purchase complete hardware packages. There are various data sets, including triangulation, location, recording, and reporting platform. Data is recorded on a user's laptop before it ever goes to the internet. The user then selects the data to upload. There's some videos that he showed that demonstrates how the software and hardware automatically can lock onto objects, such as planes or even the ISS. They had some stuff showing things locking onto objects against cloudy backgrounds. It's pretty cool stuff, actually, to watch this and see what this software is capable of. And from a standpoint of citizen science, that's been some pretty good progress, and people have come a long way with that. So they're making advances in this area, and it becomes to the point where, yeah, sure, it's not military grade, but it's not bad. It's actually a big leap forward in a lot of places. Roni came on and he presented cases from South America and showed video that used some of the cameras that Ronald had discussed, which was very interesting to say the least. Roni was also talking about the phenomenon may have caused a hardware failure or an alteration in his system. There's like photos that he took of an object that looked one way when he was recording it, and then after the fact, it looked like the pictures had been altered, possibly by the phenomenon itself. I don't know, but he was speculating that this stuff may have caused a hardware failure or some sort of alteration in his system. There's another interesting photo that he showed taken with a smartphone near a volcano in the Atacama Desert, I believe is in Chile, showing a fiery snake-like anomaly. Then on King George Island, Antarctica in December of 2025, an anomaly split in two and merged again, but the Brazilian Navy lacked the appropriate instrumentation to properly record the event. Roni concludes that UAP is linked to preserved ecosystems, geological resources, geological activity, magnetic fields, and related phenomena. It can like he said, it can disrupt equipment. It may alter evidence after it's collected. It can also adjust its physical characteristics based on the equipment used to observe it, which is very quantum mechanics. If anybody has ever studied quantum mechanics, you know that Once something is observed, it changes its characteristics dramatically, and that's kinda what we're talking about here a little bit. Roney indicated that approximately 50% of his cases involve water, which, to some extent contradicts what Richard said earlier. So Richard Dolan was talking about how the USO, uh, occurrence and the frequency of the occurrence was much lighter on the water-based side, the USO side, than the aerial side. And Roney was indicating, it's a 50-50 split. So kind of interesting stuff to take into consideration there. But I think this panel was really good as far as furthering the whole notion of citizen science and what people, average citizens can do, some of the tools that are being put out to them, software, hardware, things that are a little bit more affordable to make it easier on people to, get into this and start helping to track these UFOs. Cause I think what it was, the one who was saying, Richard talking about 150,000 nodes, that's quite a few people having these setups in their backyard to track the skies and that sort of thing. Not impossible. Got to get the price down, but it's not impossible. Then we got into the next panel, which was extremely science heavy. I will say, if I made mistakes, this might be where it is because there's a lot of science going on here. Very heavy sort of stuff. So hopefully I don't mess this up. But Adam Yingling was the moderator for this panel involving Massimo Teodranti, Gene Greneker, and Robert McGuire, and a lot of us know Robert McGuire, Science Bob, as we know him on X. Massimo's presentation was pre-recorded, but he was kind of discussing this concept of reverse engineering in flight that was based on multi-wavelength observatory plan that used electromagnetic and optical surveillance equipment along with AI to identify anomalies. If they can successfully do this, then they can use high-resolution spectrographs, and he felt those are very important to try to identify what was going on here. They talked about the all sky camera that could be used to some extent to distinguish between prosaic objects, pure plasma, a magnetoplasma powered machine, or a machine that may use this so-called warp bubble that we heard about in Age of Disclosure. Other sensors could include a pan tilt zoom camera, FLIR, a magnometer, a gravimeter, which again is useful for warp bubble detection, particle detectors, or an EEG to possibly detect biological effects on a person, which I'd never heard that before, but it does make sense. If you're looking for some sort of brain shift or something, I'm not talking about like a midline shift, like a stroke or something, but just a subtle sort of shift in somebody, maybe from a cognitive standpoint or something going on temporarily. Yeah, the EEG might be a good tool for that. The spectrograph, though, is going to be the primary tool for analysis. And it is the primary scientific goal is to detect high-intensity magnetic fields. So that's what it is. He said something like, this is allegedly a physics light endeavor, which I thought was an odd statement. It's like, doesn't sound like physics light to me. Massimo laid out on one of the slides the sensors required to detect UAP, which again, like I said, I'm not going to be reprinting slides when this stuff happens. But Gene's presentation focused on the use of radar for tracking UAP. Radar offers many advantages, and the primary radar used would be an air traffic control radar or phased array radar. But the FAA and the United States Air Force are not going to share radar data with the citizen scientists, citing security reasons more often than not. Understandable. I think we can all agree on that. However, and this is the first time we heard this concept mentioned in the panel, and this would come up a few more times, passive radar can be used effectively. It's a system that can be operated from home. No FCC transmitting license is required. A passive radar system, though, is not yet widely available. It's almost there. They've almost got it ready for use. And once it is, then the citizen scientists can operate their own radar and conduct UAP research from home. You can have multimodal detection. This can improve UAP data quality. Then Bob came on, and he's actively working on UAP USO tracking. And this is the part where I was trying to get, and I wanted to post this. Bob should have had an hour minimum. Passive radar and what Bob has designed is the answer if enough people join in. He was my favorite presenter, just needed more time. I agree. Bringing Bob on at the very tail end of this did not give him enough time, but I'm going to kind of give an idea of what Bob was talking about. Like I said, this is a very stripped down version because Bob was very deep into the science. And the cool thing also, as this summit was going on this weekend, a lot of the presenters would then end up in the chat. And as these seminars, these sessions are going on, you would see people like Bob McGuire was putting something in the chat. Kevin Knuth was in one of the chats. I'll talk about that in a minute. You had one where Jerry Tedesco was very active on day 2 after he got done with his thing. So you had a lot of the people who were involved in this lectures who would then transition into the chats after we went along. But getting back into this, so Bob's actively working on UAP USO tracking. He's using the Orange Pi 6 Plus. And Bob indicated he may have cracked the code to getting the most out of this, which has been difficult so far, to say the least. And that's what I gathered from Bob as he was talking. But this thing is freaking loaded with tech. I mean, like the UAP detector is a fun item to grab for $275, but what Bob's using here, this Orange Pi 6 Plus, dwarfs that by comparison, just what he's got loaded into this thing. It supports RF and SDR layers with built-in ADS-B receivers for aircraft correlation. Bob's actively using the code, uploading the data to improve data collection. He's working on timing and synchronization of data, which are, of course, critical. AI classification at the edge, a multi-sensory fusion engine. Like I said, this thing was loaded. And there's a lot of more you can go into, and I would welcome Bob to jump on wherever and explain this in more detail to the folks who are truly interested, like Mike, like myself. The big reveal Bob had was the Richard Dolan USO data detector that he's been working on. This is going to include deep and shallow water physics and magnetic validation, and he wants to make that more affordable for citizen scientists. So if you know anything about USOs, those have been difficult to track. That's been hit and miss. The Tedescos have had some luck with that, and we're about to talk about them in the next panel. But it's a hit and miss endeavor. But Bob has been working on this with Richard, and it sure sounds like, from everything I gathered, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, it does sound like there were some breakthroughs there, that he's got some real promising stuff going on the USO detection. The deep and shallow water physics with magnetic validation, that's big. That's something that we have not had yet. And that's a aspect of this whole thing that I think really can amp this up to an entirely different sort of levels. That was really cool stuff to listen to Bob do that. And I agree with Mike. It would have been good if Bob had more time to work on this. But, you know, and if there is a complaint you can make about the summit, is that it was great to have all these panels, but yeah, there's some that you could say, well, could we have given those guys an extra hour? You know, that sort of thing. And Bob might have been one of these guys who would have benefited from having an extra 30 minutes at least for this science heavy sort of stuff. Let's move on. I talked about them earlier, the Tedesco brothers. So we got the brothers on here, Jerry and John. I think it's John and Jerry Tedesco. Did I get that right? I think that's right. Anyway, the brothers were very familiar with them. They're using cross-modal detection methods. They have the familiar Nightcrawler, but they also now have a maritime-based vehicle. So they've got like a speedboat that's like water Nightcrawler. I don't know if that's exactly accurate, but they do have the ability now. They're going out there and getting into the USO aspect of things as well. The Nightcrawler, of course, is using the electromagnetic spectrum as a primary source for its cross-modal analysis. They feel this spectrum is the only physics-based framework that supports independent corroboration. All credible UAP observations are electromagnetic interactions. The electromagnetic spectrum enables cross-modal validation. They're using a mix of active and passive radar spectrum, RF spectrum monitoring. They can identify drones, aircraft, marine traffic signatures. They're using non-imaging electromagnetic environmental detection devices. These are highly sensitive to solar blind measurements. And the UV detectors are used to minimize the sun as any sort of source of wavelengths, electrical arcs, coronal events, stuff that can throw the observations off or give false positives or anything like that. These things they're using are great for plasma studies, and plasma is going to become a big talking point in a little bit. UV detection signals an active physical phenomenon and not, for instance, a reflection. So they've got imaging devices using electro-optical components, UV, IR blocking filters. They're also using mid-wave infrared thermal cameras. It is predominantly a FLIR-based system, but they have 4 ranges of infrared that they're using. So it's not just the stuff they're using is very advanced, and it's not just FLIR. They're using like I said, 4 different ranges of infrared. And I'm like, I didn't really realize there were that many different ranges, but there are. and the Tedesco brothers are using all that stuff. They said these are great for transmedium objects and USO studies. So there you go again. You talk about the work Bob's doing with Richard. You got the Tedescos. They're now able to track USOs a little bit more effectively. So you see this momentum starting to build from, these guys. I mean, let's be honest. These are upper echelon levels of citizen science, of course, with the Tedescos. And yeah, plasma will be the new word to drink, not national security. Yeah, plasma becomes a big issue as we go along, especially like the last one. But like I was saying, the USO stuff, the Tedescos, Bob McGuire, these guys who are upper echelons of citizen science and that sort of thing. So the Tedescos mentioned they're also using a long range infrared camera. This is well suited to tracking even minor temperature changes. Cameras they're using, of course, have digital zoom and 4K. They're emphasizing conformity standards and note that they typically perform not accredited calibration, which I know when somebody says, well, why isn't it accredited? They go into detail as to why that's a pain in the ass to deal with. And it makes sense after they explain it, why they do the non-accredited calibration, which really the only people doing the accredited stuff is probably the military guys. So again, you got to get into all that sort of thing. They follow quality assurance methods recognized in the field. They wanted to show some videos from stuff happening in August and November of 2022, but they couldn't get them to play. They did show a pretty impressive picture of a black triangle from Holbrook, New York from August 29th, 2025. So this stuff's relatively recent. They did get a video to play though, showing an object approximately 15 feet above the water. This was taken on February 13th, 2022. And this object is like a glowing orb and you can see it casting a reflection on the water. So, it's not, not a plate defect or a camera error, probably, that sort of thing. And it's not a bird or a seagull. They don't typically reflect on the water. But anyway, I digress. But yeah, the Tedescos had a very good presentation. Again, a lot of the stuff I said, they're extremely science heavy. Hopefully they release some of their own information so you can see exactly, the setup that they're using, which they got into in a lot of detail. It's really cool. That Nightcrawler is a badass vehicle. That's all I can say about it. That thing is awesome. And that kind of brought us to the end of day one. Adam, Reed, and Rich had their closing remarks. And what they said is collaboration is the theme of the day. Citizen science is the way forward. Following the data is critical. Data leads to disclosure was a big mantra going on the whole weekend. Adam noted that plasma, here we go, what Mike's talking about, plasma can be detected with the right sensors. And that was aptly demonstrated today. There are numerous examples of that, the progress being made to detect plasma. Rich talked about the importance of standardization, calibration of equipment, etc. Reed was really impressed by how many groups are already factoring in prosaic objects into their considerations and conclusions. So he was impressed that, hey, they're already trying to rule out this more mundane stuff that can throw people off. Adam was interestingly looking forward to the Skywatcher update on day 2. Sounded like he had some inside information. That's not exactly going to come to fruition, as we're going to see. Adam Yingling, as we know, was involved with Skywatcher, but it's really going to come down to Gary Nolan and, gosh, I'm forgetting his name now. Hold on, let me skip down because I will remember it here. James Fowler. Yeah, so it's going to come down to them as we go along. And sorry, James, that was just escaping my mind. But one thing that comes out is the funding for these projects. It's not excessive, but it's emphasized in numerous places for obvious reasons. Data sets are not cheap. Somebody's going to come out here and say, oh, these guys are just grifting and looking for money. Dudes, this stuff is not cheap. This costs money. James Fowler, thank you. Thank you, Mike. It took me a while. I got there. I eventually got there, but I had to skip down into my notes. There's too many people involved. I just like, who? I'm trying to remember all the names, but thank you, Mike. Yeah, James Fowler. But to get back to the whole notion of funding, this stuff, again, is not cheap. And nobody, anybody who's doing real science needs funding. You look at the crap going on with the Epstein files and how many scientists got sucked into this tangentially because they're just looking for funding for their projects. Scientists are not generally wealthy, and none of these endeavors are going to be cheap or easy, and they all require funding. And, there's active calls. If anybody knows a billionaire, hook us up with that. So it's not a grift. Science is not a grift. If you think science is a grift, then I don't know what to tell you other than you're wrong. And that's just the way it is. The fact that these guys are actively looking for funding for these projects, I don't begrudge them that at all. It's just the nature of the beast, the nature of the world. Get over it. It's just the way that things go. So, okay. With that being said, where is this? Back to this. Okay. All right. Onward we go. Day 2. There we go. All right. So on day 2, we got into this thing and yeah, let me post this up here because Mike's got a good no funding equals no answers. It's a hard truth. The sooner we face it, the quicker we can get answers. Absolutely. I mean, that Mike summed it up much better than I did there. But it's a God honest truth. All this stuff costs money. I hate that stuff that everybody thinks that anything that anybody does on this topic is a grift. It's not a grift if you're looking for answers. And the only way to, like Mike's saying, the only way to get answers is to have funding. So this notion that everything's just this bullshit grift is it's such a myopic point of view and really just misguided in so many different ways. Anyway, I don't want to get on the soapbox. Let's get back to day 2 and keep the good times rolling here. Opening remarks from Reed, Adam, and Rich on day 2. Reed restates the summit's main purpose to establish scientific standards, foster collaboration, secure research funding, advance citizen science, and ensure transparency. Data is, as has been stressed all weekend, the key. Rich stressed the importance of maintaining collaboration after this weekend and avoiding this event becoming just a one-off sort of situation. Adam discussed the UAP data pipeline key attributes, which we'll come back to at the end, such as it being led by citizen scientists, using network surveillance, people sharing methods, transparency, international collaboration, which we're about to get into. He discussed how affordable equipment for citizen scientists is crucial. He did note that the more advanced, higher cost equipment can be deployed to hotspots and that sort of thing, and to move equipment to places where the activity is the highest. Then paid tribute to Francis Ridge, who was a pioneer of MADAR, magnetic data collection, and that sort of thing. We would hear Francis's name a few times. I guess he just passed away at like the end of January, which was clearly a pretty big loss for these guys and a big loss for the community. So toast, raise your glasses to Francis Ridge, not alcohol, but it'll have to do. So anyway, a somber moment. Let's move on. Richard Dolan, he's back. I told you Richard would be back. He's moderating the next panel. Philippe Alaris, Gary Hesseltine, and Eamon Ansbro. And this panel dealt predominantly with international issues, and this was really good stuff. Philippe discussed the ESA, the European Space Agency, and he mentioned they lack a dedicated UAP program. It's primarily civilian-oriented, and its mandate is astrobiology, planetary science, and exoplanets. They do not specifically study UAPs, but they do focus on transparency and credibility in science and communication. As a civilian space agency, ESA, we'll just call it ESA. And I know that's the same initials as the Brazilian military outfit in Virginia, but this is just what it is, guys. ESA relies on ground and space-based observational infrastructure. They track the trajectories of objects such as satellites, meteors, and atmospheric phenomena. He discussed space-based sensing and its importance. Data is calibrated, reliable, and verifiable. The infrastructure is cost-efficient and leverages satellite constellations and AI-driven data exploitation. Satellites are highly useful for many observations, but they're not optimized to detect UAP. This is something that, Burleson was talking about, that our system is not optimized to detect UAP. It's the same in Europe. And that's a recurrent theme that you'll hear, that the satellites are great. They can detect all this great stuff. They can see all these things, but they're not set up to detect UAP. So maybe somebody needs to calibrate that differently or fix that. Optical and multispectral sensing can sometimes capture transient moving objects, though, or short-lived phenomena, which are, of course, of interest to the study of UAP. Across all domains, challenges include observational constraints, distinct differences between land-based and maritime observations, so there's that dichotomy again, and high rates of false positives. A focus on generic detection of transient objects rather than specifics is recommended. Institutions must balance openness with their mandate and responsibility, science, transparency, and methodological rigor remain essential. So that kind of sums up what's going on with the European Space Agency, that they're not focused on UAP. It's kind of a something that happens coincidentally every once in a while, but they're not set up for it. And that sort of thing. And Philippe was very open about that, which I appreciated. Harry Hesseltine, I think it's Hesseltine. He discussed the state of UAP research in the UK post 2017. And I think Gary was just on Andy's show, that UFO podcast, within the last couple weeks, I believe. But he's talking about the state of UAP research in the UK post 2017. As a former member of the Royal Air Force Police, he criticized the Ministry of Defense for closing the UFO reporting desk in 2009, which he believes was deliberately intended to fragment UAP data collection in the UK. And we've heard that from a couple of places. Nick Pope has, I think, said pretty much the same thing. On the surface, the UK has appeared to distance itself from the US on the issue of UAP since 2017 in the New York Times article. A Freedom of Information documents obtained by a very familiar name to those of us in the community, Grant Levac, revealed that behind the scenes, the UK is being briefed by the Pentagon. And in May of 2023, there was a full-day briefing on UAP in the Five Eyes nations. Where have we heard this before? A government denying any sort of interest in UAP, and behind the scenes, disclosed through Freedom of Information, you discover that that is not the case. And here's another example of that. Gary's a big proponent of what Ryan Graves has done with the Americans for Safe Aerospace Initiative, and Gary started something similar for UK pilots to report UAP activity, but all attempts to initiate dialogue so far have fallen on deaf ears, which of course is unfortunate. In May of 2021, he was one of the founders of ICER, the International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research. This is about a global approach to UAP research and data collection to sustain momentum. It's the only way to create real change, in Gary's opinion. So I thought Gary was a very effective speaker, and I loved hearing from him because, with the exception of what I get from Andy on that UFO podcast, I hardly hear anything going on in the UK. And even he would be the first to tell you there's nothing going on in the UK on the UAP front. So hearing Gary kind of talk about the issues that they run into was illuminating, not encouraging, but illuminating, because you think, geez, there's been a bunch of stuff happen in the UK over the years. Rendlesham is just the tip of the iceberg, Lankenheath and that sort of stuff. So it's like, wow, why aren't you guys more interested in this anyway? Eamon Ansbro, he's involved with SETI Kingsland, and they use a range of instrumentation, including tracking cameras and spectrographs. Now, these are specifically designed to track UAP, and got some cool statistics here. From 1997 to 2025, they have tracked a morphology of UAP at Lau Key, which is a location in this Kingsland area. I believe this is Australia, if I'm remembering correctly. And they've tracked 40 such sightings with a 82.5% of the sightings, that's 33 cases, have been orbs that appear to be plasma-based. So there's the plasma connection again. They've also tracked cylinders, discs, triangles, which I'm noticing in my document is spelled incorrectly. Let me fix that. And dumbbells are also present, but in much lower numbers. They have a fascinating theory on orbital tracks synchronized with Earth's rotation and an automated monitoring program around Earth. They're studying potential plasma craft to conduct polarization and high ionization studies and determine its power source. Plasma was the predominant factor, accounting for almost all of the UAP observed in this Lau Key region. Obviously, a stationary landed craft might provide significant data. That seems pretty obvious if you could find one. There are concerns about serious perceptual or physical issues for longer exposures. And Eamon was talking about how sunglasses, sunblocking UV would all be critical. There also appeared to be a relationship between human cognitive abilities and UAP detection, which kind of slides into the psionic sort of things. But we're going to hear from James Fowler a little bit later on about that whole psionic aspect of things with Skywatcher. Early results from their theory support that they do need to redesign and redevelop their instrumentation. Further tests are underway at new locations. Observational opportunities to develop exist through an interaction with the intelligence. They're focusing on mobile instruments at new and different locations, and they feel opportunities exist to study interactivity with the intelligence behind these plasma craft. So you see some kind of an interesting mix of things going on here. Philippe talking about how the European Space Agency, they're not really equipped to detect UAP and they're looking for different things, much more space-based, which is understandable. That's kind of their charter. Gary talking about the UK's pretty abysmal approach to UAP right now. Just this, on the surface, it's disinterest, but behind the scenes, they appear to be quite interested in all this. Why are we, why just, even more secretive than the US, it would seem. And then you've got Eamon talking about how their systems are being used to design to track UAP. And they've got some pretty cool statistics, really high, 82.5% of the 40 sightings are orbs that are plasma based. That's probably not a coincidence. So it's always cool. I always love this stuff where you get the morphology and you get statistics and hard data, empirical data to back this stuff up. And I understand some debunkers going to be out there saying there's no evidence of any of this stuff. Kind of is, I mean, yes, it's not the proof. And, Gary Nolan will talk about that in a little bit, but it's still data. It's still tracking. There's still things that they're observing and they're able to come up with a morphology for this. You can't just say, it's all hogwash and nonsense. These are science-based observations. Anyway, I will get off my soapbox there. Adam Yingling, he moderated the next panel with Mark Roediger and Robert Spearing. Adam read a statement from Peter Davenport. Yeah. Let me post this up here for Mark. I feel like the UK is a lesson to be studied by the USA, folks. We need to change citizen data. Yeah, absolutely. Mike is on fire tonight, guys. I just say, and I'm glad he's here so I can feel like I'm not completely talking to myself, which helps maintain my own sanity. But no, he's right. And I think Mike would agree that the primary focus of this summit was a shift towards citizen science, citizen data, citizen disclosure. Again, what Matthew Brown had talked about months ago. That's where the differences are going to come from. That's where the biggest changes are going to stem from, is from this notion of citizen science, citizen data, citizen disclosure. It's going to take a much more concerted effort, and more people need to jump in. If you really want to get to disclosure of whatever this is, jump into the deep end, and I understand I'm not advocating you guys go and spend $5,000 for a radar array in your backyard. I'm not saying that, but there are things you can do. Like we talked about earlier, for $275, that's not bad. Get out there and go and do this sort of thing. And you just jump in there. And I mean, there's probably a entry point that is affordable and comfortable for most of us. And I think this is really going to come down to citizens who are going to need people like us, who are going to have to jump into this and do our own research and just flood everything with all this data. Because the more people, everybody says, look up to the skies, you never know what you'll see. I think that's Andy's tagline. Sorry, Andy, I didn't mean to steal that from you, but it's true, because you look up, you don't know what you'll see. And the more people who've got things trained at the sky, like even some of the cameras that we're about to talk about, that all helps. So let me get back to this, because Adam read a statement from Peter Davenport of Newfork, National UFO Reporting Center, who reports receiving 1 to 2 dozen new reports per day. Still, 1 to 2 dozen reports a day of new sightings. Yeah. That's right. Spend $275. Give your wife my email and phone number for complaints. Yes. Send your hate tweets too. No, I'm just kidding. I'm gonna out my other podcasting co-hosts. I'm sure they would appreciate that immensely, but I won't do that. I'll leave them alone. But Mark was noting when Mark Roediger got on here that nearly all UAP data originate from human observations. We are the primary. How cool. So we got Ivan is in here too. He's spying on Mike. He's not doing anything wrong, Ivan. I'm telling you, he's actually keeping me sane tonight with his commentary and not getting himself into trouble or me, mostly. Anyway, like we're saying, Mark was indicating that we are the primary sensors. It's not so much the equipment out there, but human observation is the primary sensors. UFO organizations are therefore essential. Information's being cataloged includes metadata, descriptive attributes, witness accounts, and a classification of the experience. And this goes into close encounters of the first, second, third, fourth kind, so forth. He discusses UAP databases. UFOCAT was founded way back in 1967. It's more of a bibliographic index built from reports on sightings, not just sighting reports. He then discusses Newfork and MUFON, which compiles sighting reports, includes both investigated and uninvestigated cases. He then discusses, of course, Project Blue Book, which is comprehensive but not digital. Larry Hatch created the U database, which ran as a program on DOS, and it's apparently still available somewhere. I'm not sure where. It's very effective for research. They talked about databases such as Itacat and Humcat that focus on specific types of reports. So if you're looking for a specific type of UAP or a specific type of craft or something like that, you can go to, there's databases for that. He indicates these are important for detection as they can help to identify geographic clustering, temporal patterns, and hotspots. There were, at this point in the chat that was going on, and I noticed this, and Mike probably noticed this as well, there are lots of calls in the chat at this point for a consolidated database, which can be very challenging in concept to put together a consolidated UAP database. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit later on because I think somebody else addressed that. Mark discussed several of these problems, including inconsistent. We'll get right into it. He discussed several of the problems for a consolidated database, including inconsistent reporting standards, inconsistent classification schemes, human error, reporting bias. But then he praised Europe, which is funny, for its efforts to integrate databases. So Europe can't get their shit together in some places, but in other places, they're trying to integrate UAP databases. So, okay, well, we're not going to admit it's real, but if it is, let's get ourselves together and integrate all these databases. He noted the lack of a database to effectively address abductions and related issues like that, and I don't believe that there's really a dedicated abduction database. Robert then came on and he discussed MUFON field investigators and noted challenges there, including witness bias again, and getting there too late. These guys are usually arriving after the event's already occurred rather than getting there as it's occurring or in advance, which of course it's like trying to predict where lightning is going to strike or a tornado. Yeah, let's find a tornado before it strikes. Yeah, the network of people and egos, as Mike's saying. It's not easy to do any of this stuff. And a consolidated database that's going to ignore egos and people and biases and all that fun stuff. Difficult. But Robert was talking about MUFON. He said anybody can really become a field investigator for MUFON. So again, this is a citizen aspect of things. It's like $50 a year. You can get access to the Project Aquarius digital library, which is searchable. And Robert says MUFON hides nothing. He acknowledges that the MUFON witness report form in the past has been rather cumbersome because it takes roughly 30 minutes to complete. That's not very user-friendly. The MUFON database, though, is extensive to say the very least. He agreed with Rich Hoffman that 90% of what is seen is explainable. And I think that's a lot of what a lot of us have said in the past here. That's it, about 90% of what's out there is explainable. It's that other 10% that we don't know what the hell is going on. Richard criticized Enigma Labs for its claim that there were 9,000 USO sightings within 10 miles of the coastline. He felt this was inaccurate and irresponsible. In the chat, though, Jerry Tedesco disagreed with this statement, and he noted that he has seen USOs within 10 miles of the coastline. So, there's a disagreement here. This is not going to be the only disagreement we see as we go along here. MUFON is developing an app called Andrus, and it sounds like, like most of the apps are out there right now. It's going to include in-app purchases, but there are some notable features that are going to be built into this app, including the potential for real-time alerts on sightings that users can correlate with each other and possibly get a triangulation on something. So that's kind of cool. If somebody sees a sighting and they throw up a real-time alert, say, hey, it's coming your way, and you get a bunch of people who say, I've seen it, I'm seeing something here, you can triangulate positions and maybe you can get some really good data on whatever you're seeing. They've got some interesting data on unknowns cited between the first 6 months of 2025 in the US and Europe. Roughly 8% of these were cigars/cylinders, which is something that we haven't seen a whole lot of. In the US, though, 5.6% of these were triangles, while in Europe that was only 3.4%, which does increase the possibility that what people were observing were black tech or advanced tech over here in the United States that may not be so readily available over, it may not be in the skies as much over in Europe. But yeah, I spend $50 at MUFON looking into what is in your area of mistaken identity and what has not been identified. See what's going on out there. For $50 a year, that's pretty cheap as far as like, being able to come into this situation better armed and not flying so blindly. It is kind of interesting. Not a huge difference though between 5.6% and 3.4%, but that's enough to look at it and say, okay, well, why are the triangles more prevalent in the US and Europe? And it may be, the increase in seeing triangular craft and stuff like that in the US. And there's been a definite uptick in that the past few months. You know, this UAP Summit I kind of called in a few places like the WrestleMania of UAP conferences earlier, because it was 2 days like WrestleMania. And I would say, as far as the summit was concerned, there might have been a double main event. And we're going to get to the first of the main events here, and this was Gary Nolan. Richard Dolan moderated this conversation with Gary Nolan, and a lot of people were, for very obvious reasons, waiting to see what Gary would say. And he had to say a lot. And there's a lot in here that I took down. And this is one of those places where I took a lot of screenshots to gather some of the information. And there's a reason for that I'm going to talk about. Gary did discuss Skywatcher, and he cautioned that he was speaking for himself and not as a representative for Skywatcher. He admitted most of what he said was speculation. With Skywatcher, he was an invisible participant. His goal was to implement scientific rigor for what he classified as a trial run, which mostly involved preliminary data. Skywatcher faced tricultural friction amongst three epistemologies. That's a mouthful, and I'm not even going to try and repronounce that because talking too much. Science, but the three factors involved were science, the military, and venture capital. So you can see right off the bat, those are three areas that are not going to jive with each other so well most of the time, right? So you can already see kind of the beginnings of the problem that Skywatcher was facing. His goal was always to get the data peer reviewed, but competing priorities were an obstacle. Other issues included amateur satellite tracking and flight logging bots, which created a zero privacy expectation. So Skywatcher had no expectation of privacy. The intelligence community that had a clear interest in what was happening, as their research could be considered a threat to narrative control. He discussed the distinctions among data, evidence, and proof. And this is something that gets really deep in the weeds and things that we've all talked about. As far as a lot of people like to throw these three concepts around interchangeably, they're not. And Gary kind of explains that here. Data are raw observations that are often noisy and anecdotal. Okay. Evidence is validated data, contextualized and multi-sensor in nature. The multi-sensorial aspect of things is the ideal. Proof is compelling, undeniable, and reproducible. It could be physical artifacts, could be biological samples. It could even be an information transfer. And if you're not sure what that means, think of the movie Contact. That's an information transfer where you've got something transferred from one intelligence to another, through a non-conventional means like we got in Contact. There could be a violation of physics as well. Gary discussed verification thresholds, including the Sagan standard, which is the whole extraordinary evidence requires extraordinary proof, which he's considered over 99% proven. There's strong evidence, which would be over 90%, and basically just detection, which he said would be a better than 50% certainty. Skywatcher's mission statement was to uncover and deliver accurate, timely, and comprehensive aerial intelligence on UAP. Gary specifically denied that this was a government-controlled operation. He saw zero evidence of that. But there was a mix of science, former military, and so forth operating within the Skywatcher team. They answered to no one, not even to their investor, who he did not divulge who that was. Skywatcher was using concepts such as long-range optics and imagery analysis, active and passive telemetry, electromagnetic analysis, kinematic performance analysis, and specific protocols to validate anomalies. They were looking to bridge the gap between anecdotal observation and scientific verification. He noted there were algorithmic blind spots, a synthetic blindness where UAP exists in the raw sensor data, but remained invisible in the tactical display. Now, there's a part here where Gary, and Mike will probably validate this, that he rushed through many of the slides that talked about data collection methods and things like that, and the specific scientific stuff they were using. It seemed to be a way to save time. but it also kind of felt a little bit odd, almost like he didn't want anybody looking at this for too long. And there could be multiple reasons for that. I'm not accusing Gary of hiding the ball or anything like that. And what he was showing in the brief time you could look at it was highly science heavy. So it would have been a bog for most people to get through that. But it did kind of feel a little bit odd, like you just flipping through, like you're spending like 2 seconds on a slide and going to the next one. So it almost, and I don't know if there's anything proprietary in there, probably not. I can't imagine anything like that, or anything that maybe something that kind of got up, crept up to close to the line, and he just said, I'm just going to skip by this. I don't know. And again, I'm not accusing Gary of anything. It just seemed like those were rushed through a little bit quickly. And it felt a little bit strange, but nothing too bad out of the ordinary. And it could have been that it just would have been overwhelming to do that. It was unclear. What is clear, though, is that Gary did not feel comfortable with the data that Skywatcher had obtained, or maybe not comfortable. Confident is probably the better word to use here. He discussed trimodal validation, with low confidence being a single sensor track, medium confidence involving multi-sensor correlation through radar and infrared, and high confidence with full corroboration being radar, infrared, RF frequencies, and visual. With Skywatcher, he talked about the results. He said they're still analyzing the data. There are some tracks of interest, but they also isolated several prosaic objects. Further analysis of those tracks might provide sufficient data for a report. He did not feel Skywatcher met the multi-sensor data collection metrics they had set. He believes that with 3 sensors, you can meet the Sagan standard. He discussed an event in which a jellyfish was visible from the ground, while a helicopter in the air could not get closer to the UAP no matter what they did. They could not move forward, they could only move backwards. James is going to talk about this as well. He considers this evidence of something strange. Gary then confirmed that he has signed an NDA, and that was all he could say about Skywatcher, which, probably, yeah, Gary was getting bothered about the Skywatcher questions, whether there was a landing or not. Yeah, they wanted, there was not so much question about data, but aliens. And I'm about to get to Gary does address the landing issue. But the fact that he'd signed an NDA, probably not surprising given the nature of what they were dealing with at Skywatcher. Still interesting to hear him confirm that there was an NDA involved. And I don't know if I doubt there's anything to really make of that, but it was interesting to hear him confirm that there's an NDA involved, even though he was an invisible observer sort of thing. But, we'll take that for what it will, but he did confirm that was in play. And again, I don't think that that's a really big deal, probably to be expected in the whole grand scheme of what Skywatcher was doing. He then talks about a little bit at the end, the 3D atomic imaging of the Ubatuba sample did show some anomalous readings in silicon isotopic ratios compared to those observed in what you would expect in a more ground-based sample. He openly questioned, could the isotopic anomalies be the result of a specific physical process? Some anomalous properties were also noted with the so-called Arts Parts sample, including its absorption properties. He's fairly certain Arts Parts were the result of a manufactured process, and not any sort of a smelting process. He did feel there was an anomalous signal involved there. Then we get into what Mike was talking about with some Q&A, and people want to know about Skywatcher. Gary denied that anything ever landed or that there was any sort of material collection. He kind of punted on the question of whether Skywatcher will continue, and he questioned whether they really need to continue. He said it was very expensive to operate. It was tasked to build a dedicated, scientifically rigorous UAP sensor network. The intent was to implement a four-phase framework to replace anecdotes with physics-based validation and multi-sensor correlation. They did not quite meet those standards, as we noted previously. And there was a little bit of loose discussion at the end about directed energy weapons and some of the symptoms related to that sort of exposure in Havana syndrome. And that's it for Gary Nolan. A whole lot of information there, obviously. And I think the big thing to take away from this is that Gary didn't feel that Skywatcher met the expectations that they had set. And I don't think that's a surprise for any of us who've followed this topic for any length of time. They do, and it's interesting when you contrast that against James Fowler and what he says at the end, which is like the double part of the double main event. And we'll get into that in a moment. But it just seems like, yeah, I mean, the whole notion of Skywatcher and what their goal was to be able to publish stuff by they're still going through the data. And I think James agrees with that as well. They're still going through the data. There's terabytes upon terabytes of this stuff to go through. Will that yield anything? I don't know. Gary did not seem like he sounded that optimistic about it. I don't know if James really sounded that much more optimistic, to be honest, and we'll get to that in a minute. Like I said, I will post all these notes up when this episode drops. You guys can read through it on yourself, or better yet, go watch the lecture yourself and make up your own determinations as to what Gary was saying and not saying. We then we took the break. They came back and we got into the more like social media kind of panel involved. It was Reed Summers, Richard Dolan, Matt Ford, Kevin Wright, Chrissy Newton. They were all on here. Richard and Matt applauded Reed for a very successful conference, but they both remained very skeptical about disclosure. And Matt echoed Carl Nell's view that we have reached the end of this disclosure cycle. He did feel good, though, that Eric Burleson was still committed to the UAPDA. Chrissy took a much more, it is a practical approach, although she freely admitted this was not going to sit well with a lot of people who are so focused on disclosure, but she believes there are much bigger issues in the world right now, such as Epstein, and UAP is going to persist through all that. Richard agreed with this and noted that with the world fracturing as much as it is, national security is going to be an even bigger issue. So instead of people getting more freewheeling with information, it's going to get tighter. And we've heard this from many people as well. This seems to be a recurrent theme. He's highly pessimistic that anything's going to move things forward. He noted that, David Grush's amazing testimony had no real impact. Matt believed the UAP issue is going to persist as well. He anticipates a major event taking place given that Congress has authorized the shoot down now of UAS, but he doesn't think that it's actually going to happen, which is going to raise a range of issues and concerns. You guys have the authority to do this. Why aren't you doing it? We'll see how that turns out. Kevin felt that the government wants to turn all UAP into drones because if they're all drones, then they're not UAP. Makes sense. Chrissy believed the topic is less fluid or fast-moving in Canada than in the U.S. There's a more measured approach. Canadian citizens want this approach from the scientific perspective. Interesting stat that she quoted here. I'm not sure where she got this from. It'd be worth looking into. Over 60% of the Canadians would support funding for a scientific approach to UAP. I'd have to ask Chrissy where she got that from, but if that's true, they're much more open and receptive to it than people in the States are. Canada is the tortoise. The United States is the hare. That's probably an accurate description, no matter what the stats or the data say. Matt Ford recognized a tendency to rush news without full vetting, which he even admits he's been guilty of. He also cautions that legacy media still carries significant influence, despite their seemingly diminished presence in today's world. He agreed with Richard that the Wall Street Journal hit pieces from last year were directed at Congress more than the general public to kind of get Congress's attention and say, do you really want all this heat? This is all nonsense and bullshit. Look at this stuff and all that sort of stuff. Richard wondered if the public can be the driving force to move this topic forward. He kind of poked fun at recent proclamations of disclosure, including his friend Steve Bassett, who is the most eternally optimistic disclosure advocate that's out there. But even he says, I don't know. SSCI is all drones. The ship has sailed in the Senate. UAP caucus is the hope, but with not a lot of power, tough road without citizen evidence. Absolutely. Which again goes to, we got to be the ones to push this thing forward, guys. But like I said, Richard was talking about Steve Bassett, who has made proclamations of disclosure that never happens. We got Chris Bledsoe and his pending prediction. Nothing ever happens. Richard doesn't anticipate this being any different. Reed discussed how trust is declining. The credibility of evidence remains low. We rely too much on official recognition as a source for disclosure. Matt believes the legacy program will never disclose due to concerns about criminal prosecution and because doing so would disrupt the current power structure. Amen, Matt. Absolutely. I've got my own 3 observables: money, power, and control. And you're talking about probably the biggest one here, which is upsetting the power structure. He believes the citizen science approach is the only thing that will bear fruit. Again, amen, Matt. And I think Mike and I both agree with you here. There's some discussion about what it's the NHI's intent and its mixed record of benevolence and hostility. So it is not all one or the other. There are examples of these guys being nice like E.T., and being pricks like Independence Day. So There was some discussion about that. Chrissy believed UFO historians play an integral role in this conversation, enabling people to catch up, learn, and engage. Kevin believed that the more the media is directed towards science and hard data, the easier it will be to get them on board and to communicate effectively. So that panel was obviously, as you may have gathered, very pessimistic on the status of thing, and they're not wrong, because this is more looking at it from the deep state disclosure side of the fence, the official disclosure. This notion that Trump's about to make a disclosure speech in July is believe what you want, guys, but it's not happening. And I would love to be wrong. I don't think I'm going to be wrong, and I don't see anything coming from the government anytime soon, if ever. The next panel, this was an interesting one, because you got Reed Summers moderating with Michael Gold from NASA, Cecilia Levy, and Beatrice Villarreal, who most of us have heard a lot about. Michael, interesting, I did not realize that Michael had previously worked for Bigelow Aerospace, but he didn't work for Bass. He was on the NASA UAP independent study team, and Michael believed this team's existence is critical given the stigma surrounding UAP and NASA. Now, this study team was formed on May 24th, 2022, with 16 experts responsible for identifying available data and determining the best approach to collect future data. On May 31st, 2023, the first meeting was held. And on September 14th, 2023, they released their first report on how NASA could advance understanding of UAP. Then Michael discussed the significant pushback this group received for simply asking questions about UAP. Not the existence of it, but just asking questions about it, which undermines the ability, of course, to conduct meaningful scientific research. Michael believed we need to review the NASA archives more closely. He shares a photo of a triangular formation of a UAP taken by Apollo 17 astronauts from the lunar surface. Now, could be anything, could be ice crystals. You always hear that with NASA. And he wasn't drawing a conclusion as to what it might be, just to show, hey, these are in the archives. He also shows slides and photos of the infamous lunar horizon glow from Apollo 17. And then he showed another image from March of 2025 of another lunar glow that, you couldn't really explain. It wasn't the Earth, it wasn't Venus, it was something else. NASA, however, indicated it was charged lunar dust, which I gotta be honest with you guys, sounds a hell of a lot like swamp gas to me. Charged lunar dust. Swamp gas? Yee, kind of the same thing. It's the new swamp gas. Drones and charged lunar dust, the new swamp gas. Anyway, Michael is very concerned about the UAP stigma setting us up for a surprise situation where our adversaries have reverse engineered technology and is going to catch us with our pants down. Now, Kevin Knuth was in the chat for this panel, and which I thought this might be interesting based on the fact that he's involved in the Waters paper that's attempting to debunk Beatrice's work. So I thought, this might get interesting, but he only asked NASA-based questions, so that never kind of came to fruition. But there is still tension in this panel, as I'm about to get into. So Cecilia implored the need for peer review and echoes this mantra that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Beatrice, however, felt that focusing on UAP was not necessarily the best course of action. She believed people needed to move past the idea that some within this whole notion that some within the community are trying to drag others down. She was imploring cooperation, civility, and collegiality. So we're getting into this whole issue of how you've got Beatrice's research on one side, and now you've got the pushback from people within the scientific community, within the UAP community itself. And Michael kind of touches in on this. He notes how researchers face all sorts of issues from skeptics, let alone from UFO believers. So I thought at this point, Michael's trying to play peacekeeper a little bit. It's not exactly going to work, because Beatrice is going to kind of double down and say that she believed the scientific method was the key to getting research peer reviewed. But Cecilia believed that the UAP field has a general data issue, with data quality being the primary concern. She was discussing smudges, old photographs, and similar issues in which the scientific method fails and, quote, wishful thinking takes over. This was a not so subtle shot at Beatrice. And I felt at this point, and Mike, you probably will jump in, I think you probably sense the same thing, there was palpable tension between the two of them during this conversation. It was clear Cecilia was on the Waters side of the situation, trying to debunk Beatrice and that sort of thing. And there was You could sense that this was going on. Beatrice discussed confirming the existence of an object and then kind of building the science around it to verify it. And, she used an example from physics. We know electrons exist, even though we can't visualize them. Cecilia was asked, like, what would you want if you had all this funding? What kind of program would you want to do? She's like, if a program was funded, I'd want observatories built in or around UFO hotspots. Even if it turned out not to be UAP, if we got something involving a unique atmospheric anomaly, that would still be critically important. But Cecilia knows no funding will be forthcoming from the federal government. She then notes there was a push on archive for a UAP dedicated section. Yeah, it was unexpected you could tell for sure. There was no doubt about it during this segment that these two were not on the same page, and you could feel it. It was definitely, it was a little uncomfortable. I gotta be honest with some of us watching. It's like, oh, this is not so good. We're supposed to be trying to get on the same page, but it is what it is. And there is this pushback against Beatrice that has largely, I think, in my opinion, been mostly unsuccessful, but it's there. But anyway, Cecile was talking about a push for a UAP dedicated section on archive. This would be significant, because they've been rather against the whole UAP topic of conversation. Beatrice noted, this is interesting, that she has government and private funding for her research. I think Sweden or one of these countries is funding her research. She still believes sacrifices are going to be required for science to secure further funding. Michael noted that NASA lacked an adequate reporting framework and that they need to make their information more public. But at the same time, he also denied any knowledge that NASA has altered or modified any images. Sure. So that's my response. I understand Michael's got to say that, but I don't think too many of us were exactly buying that. But, that is what it is. So the next panel, we got away from the tension and that sort of thing with Beatrice and Cecilia, which, was interesting to say the least. But Rich Hoffman then moderated this next panel, which was very interesting. Fred Paulison, Rainer Hassetil, David Dominguez Hooper, and Mitch Randall. And Fred and Rainer discussed the Hesteland history and research. Now, Hesteland, for anybody who knows, is a big UFO hotspot. It's in Norway. They had over 20 sightings per week in the 80s, and it remains active, although it's down to about 20 sightings per year now. But it's still very active. Rainer showed a 1999 blue box video of a glowing light moving across the sky at a relatively low altitude. This was taken on an old analog camera, and you could still tell that there was something there. There's another 2007 video with radar corroboration. This data, he said, is all available online at the Hesteland project site, wherever that is. And there are many other phenomena occurring in Hesteland, including battery drain, drone and car malfunctions, reactions to lasers. Anybody who's watched Skinwalker Ranch will relate to some of these sudden failures. In 1983, large pieces of soil were removed and left nearby. These things weighed a lot, like, several hundred pounds. They were just carved out of the ground and moved several feet nearby. They're using a variety of equipment at Hesteland with a focus on magnetics and electrical interference. The sensors they have built are relatively inexpensive, and they have deployed them across multiple locations. They got some really compelling video of a light orb in the clouds that sped in, wiggled around a bit, and then left. That was kind of cool to watch. There's another video of a light going up the side of a mountain, which was interesting. David then discussed Eldeon, which is a multi-sensor UAP detection device. They recognize the lack of standardized data and the high cost barriers. They have two prongs to this Eldeon thing, and it's actually like, it's not spelled Eldeon. If anybody's seen like the Tool album, they've got one of the songs that's on there that has this weird spelling on this. But anyway, go look at your Tool CD collection or whatever it is for more of that. There's two prongs to this. It's a multi-sensor fusion hub and a passive radar network. So Dionysus is the name of the multi-sensor data system that uses 28 synchronized sensors. The idea is to use multiple sensors to synchronize and validate UAP events. Edge devices handle the sensors and the cameras. Now, Nemesis is their passive radar system. The Dionysus system is going to cost like $25K. So that's not going to be an entry point that citizen scientists can get behind. Nemesis, on the other hand, is only going to cost $500. It is designed for civilian researchers, scientists, and UAP enthusiasts. When multiple nemesis modes correlate an object, they can use 3D triangulation. They have an augmented reality app that can help confirm whether objects are satellites or UAPs, which sound very similar to what Flight Radar uses. Mitch discussed Operation Skywatch, which is another citizen science network for detecting and tracking UAP. They want to detect the whole sky using kinematic tracks. Instantaneous acceleration, as we know, is a significant detection problem, and it's an observable. To maximize detection volume, they want a nationwide mesh network to maximize coverage. Operation Skywatch uses a passive radar network, a video triangulation app, and a witness reporting hotline. Passive radar, again, is obviously a key issue, and radar is the holy grail of detection. It uses FM radio as its basis. Video triangulation combined with radar can actually detect an object before you see it, which is pretty cool if you think about it. This signals the app that, hey, something is coming. This can then be pushed to multiple users, and this could lead to video triangulation, which we talked about earlier. The witness hotline is another aspect, and this is what it sounds like. It can be used to corroborate a sighting. It's all highly calibrated, and if it receives scientific validation, the data from Operation Skywatch could be cited in scientific research. It's a plug-and-play system. The radar receiver is, again, $500, so there's that $500 price point. The app is free. The witness hotline would be open 24/7. They're looking for at least 10,000 of these systems, which would provide the grid coverage they are seeking. Using these for intelligence potential, such as figuring out where drones are coming from, where they are going, and recognizing patterns is very important. And like everybody else, they're seeking funding to implement this. So here's 3 more examples of citizen science, right? The Hestelin stuff is obviously more involved, and it's got a much deeper lineage and history to it. But the stuff that David Dominguez Hooper was talking about with Nemesis, not so much Dionysus, of course, because, 28 synchronized sensors, K sounds about right. But the passive radar that he's using through Nemesis and that Operation Skywatch is using, again, that $500 price point, sure, it's high, but it's doable, and it's not completely out of the realm of reason. I mean, we saw UAP detector for $275 selling out in an hour. So people are willing to spend the money on this thing once it's readily available. But again, the passive radar stuff is not all the way out there yet. It's getting closer to that. Let's get into the last real session before we close it up here. And this is the second part of the double main event, as I called it. James Fowler with Reed Summers as the moderator. Now, interestingly, Reed had just done on the Emergent podcast an interview with James like a week before the summit took place. A lot of the stuff that they were saying here was a little bit repetitive, not completely, but there was some aspect of that. But at the same time, there was some different information that was going on here as well. So James comes on here and he's talking about how he's been running war games since 2021. During one of these games, they accidentally discovered the Tetra class of UAP. And they have video of 7 Tetras flying in formation. In 2022, the dog whistle was developed. They believe multiple Class 1 UAP crashed, but massive flooding delayed any sort of adequate ground searches, so they never found it. They also observed tic tacs, blobs, beams, and the manta ray type UAP. In 2023, radar enhancements enabled them to discover the Class 6, which is the Bright Star, and the Class 7, which is the Jellyfish. He does say, this is interesting, there was an energy weapon attack against the team by a Bright Star. Interestingly, they have never seen a UAP at night. I found that, sorry guys, getting parched. I found that interesting that most of the sightings that we think of are at night. They've never seen one at night, the Skywatcher team. There was a video of a Class 3 that had been enhanced by Pro Pixels, which is Billy Kryzak, and Billy does tremendous work on anything that he's working on. And he didn't modify it, he just enhanced some of the visuals a little bit. There is also a video of an unmodified Class 6 where the auto track was not able to lock on. In 2024, they discovered the Class 8, and one was believed to have crashed, but James himself had a severe injury at this time. He had to be airlifted out of the location, and this foiled any sort of a search into recovery or investigation of this crash that they observed. In 2025, the Class 9, the Egg, and the Class 11 Barbell were discovered. Class 10 is a Tesseract, and that was discovered and developed from data collection in 2022. He then talks about Skywatcher, and then they intercepted about 25 UAPs and were within close proximity to the Class 2, 5, 7, 8, and 10. They have learned a lot by being in close proximity to UAPs. He says the UAPs appear to have different functions and mission types. These range from transportation, sensing, reconnaissance, and as noted earlier, there's some potential energy weapon offensive going on here. They've never seen a UAP from the air. In general, UAPs are not observable to the unaided human senses, but they are observable via infrared, manual optics, and radar, just for example. He stressed that commercial aviation is at risk, and UAP have been observed in commercial aviation air corridors. James feels non-government global tracking is required. He's concerned because UAP are operating with global impunity in all aspects of airspace, and they appear to be on some sort of mission, with the worst case scenario that they are hostile and we are, quoting, ants under the magnifying glass, end quotes. But all we're doing is observing them. Is that a mistake? Citizen scientists, again, will be the key. Tracking UAP is challenging and new tools are needed to address this issue. A, quote, team of teams, end quote, approach is needed. This requires researchers, scientists, subject matter experts, and the public. Tech like the dog whistle can bring these closer to us, but a variety of research elements is going to be required. Crowdsourcing across all geopolitical boundaries is the only way forward. Even then, much remains observed. Speaking of observation, he says they have observed the Tic Tac moving at Mach 30. The human eye is not going to catch that. They're not going to pick that up with the human eye. He says we need a central organization with oversight that should be nonprofit and focused on science. UAPs are a risk to human lives, and the governments have shown that they are not going to serve the needs of the public on this. Knowledge tracking and defense against UAP must occur, and only through a global effort can the threat be sufficiently understood. James believed that multiple systems, including passive radar, can pick up UAP. Then we got into the Q&A, and of course, people wanted to know about the dog whistle. And regarding the dog whistle, obviously he's not going to release the proprietary information on it. It's just not going to happen, guys. It's like, trying to get a lot of that information from Gary. But he sounded like he was concerned about overexposure. In other words, if the dog whistle were released to the general public, would it then be overused and rendered less effective, which is a valid concern. James is adamant that we need to stop being so passive in our observations, as many UAP classes exhibit offensive probing and strategic tactics that seem to escalate until we either terminate the event that's going on or take some sort of action like chasing it with a helicopter. Importantly, he believed plasma is present in all the classes he has observed, and they may be the key to how UAPs can break the sound barrier without a sonic boom. He confirmed that there was no physical recovery of UAP, but he did believe some may have crashed, and they may have, and their activities, Skywatcher's activities, may have been the cause of some of them to crash. He did not really directly answer the landing question, but I don't think he deliberately avoided it either. It just I think it was asked by Reed, and he latched onto something else and never circled back to the landing question. He does not know much about the psionic side of things, which I thought was interesting since Skywatcher had stressed the psionic aspect of things so strongly. But James is like, I didn't really know much about that. He has not observed a repeatable psionic event, although he could not definitively state that nothing ever happened on that side of the fence. He kept his team located rather far away from the psionic assets. He talked about using passive radar as being a good idea for citizen scientists, and turning cameras into sensors via IMUs will also be very helpful. Once such systems are widespread, tracking UAP becomes much more practical. Big enough pixels on targets is the key, but he said radar's not very practical. He was asked about what he thinks the phenomenon was, and he feels we are dealing with a material science paired with a propulsion system that we do not understand. He speculates it's either a very advanced enemy or something else, and the idea that an enemy is flying 15,000 sorties over the USA, unfathomable. He believes these objects exhibit 2 to 5 advanced technologies and considers that too many to be man-made. 2 to 3 of these advanced technologies, maybe that would be man-made. But he says when you combine all of this, it undermines the claim that it is man-made. So a lot of information from James there. The morphology of the various types of UAP they observed at the various places that Skywatcher was active. He didn't really get too much into the whole notion of whether Skywatcher was still active or not. And it makes sense because he's left them and started his own business and done his own thing. So while he seems to defend them in some places, his knowledge as to what their future plans are, where they might be going, what they might be doing. Understandably, that's he's not going to know all that sort of stuff. But still, you've got indications that a directed energy weapon was used on his team at some point. That some of these things are hostile, some of them aren't. You got a tic tac moving at Mach 30. That's pretty damn impressive. Um, and just some other stuff that he said that was really eye opening and that sort of thing. So we then get to the end of this whole thing, and it's Reed and it's Rich and it's Adam, and it's where do we go from here? And Rich had 10 steps. He says, we need to establish a neutral scientific coordinating body. This is going to foster legitimacy, trust, and continuity. Standardizing a taxonomy for UAP events, standardized instrumentation, sensor metadata. We need optical data such as visible and IR, radar where possible, RF spectrum monitoring, environmental sensors, GPS-based time synchronization, viewing geometry, create a federal global data and architecture. This is how astronomy and climate science work. Multi-sensor protocols reduce false positives, and misidentification. Establish transparent reporting and peer review. Transparency reduces speculation more than secrecy ever has, which I thought was a pretty cool quote. Access to comparative global data sets, separate the scientific study from threat assessment. Perhaps establish pilot regions to demonstrate the feasibility of these systems and protocols before scaling. So maybe try and get some of the citizen science in a concentrated area, see how it works, and then go from there, which makes sense. And coastal and desert regions are probably good candidates for this. Deploy standardized sensor packages and publish the results in 12 to 18 months. Which again stressed what he did in day one, that the purpose of this is to avoid another 70 to 80 years of frustrating nonsense and us chasing our own tail on this topic. Adam then came on. He returned to his UAP data pipeline, the key attributes involved. He discussed data sources, including archived data, eyewitness reports, multimodal sensor arrays, data analytics, which are ecosystem interoperability, transparency and data integrity, and data processing, which is open source based, government supported, which kind of raised an eyebrow at that, using astronomy tools alongside citizen and science UAP tools. He specifically noted many of the concepts and programs discussed this weekend, such as HumCat, Operation Skywatch, Nemesis and Dionysus, the Tedesco's Nice Crawler, ADSB exchange, and so forth. He wants mapping collection activities for high confidence, including spectrum and Bayesian truth models, which was a concept Gary talked about that I didn't get too deep into, but it is another element of the whole scientific approach. Real-time collection apps, which we already talked about, workflow automation. You talked about hyperspectral analysis in your pockets. I'm not sure what that was, but he seemed to be impressed by it, and pushing data to connected ecosystems to enable distributed collaboration. Reed then closes up by saying we believe a need to build a coalition to address this challenge, and he was very impressed by the extent of what was already available to enable collaboration on a new and different level. UFOevidence.com is something they're launching, and it's going to be launching soon. And that, my friends, is it for the UAP Summit. The last thing I will say about this, though, is they got over 500 people registered for this. If you've gone to Contact in the Desert or any of these other conferences, you know how much they charge for a day. Reed only charged $50 for this thing. 75, I think, near the end, but you could get it for 50. But still, if they had 500 people registered for this at a minimum of 50, that's $25K that they made on this event, which is not a bad return on investment at all. And that, kids, is a good way to get funding started. So you got to consider this event a massive success. I mean, just the sheer number and amount of people who were involved in this thing, who were awesome, magnificent speakers on all fronts, who were tremendous. The concept discussed and the big takeaway from this is what we've talked about here today. Citizen science is the way forward. It is becoming more accessible. It is becoming more affordable. It's, yeah, exactly, Mike. I felt like if you went to the UAP Summit, you got your money's worth, no matter your views. Absolutely. Because there's something for everybody at this event. I mean, no matter what side of the fence, if you were hardcore, you wanted to see the latest on disclosure, they had some of that. If you were a huge science nerd and just wanted to know all about the tech and the things going on, they had that. If you wanted to find out What's going on with Skywatcher? What's the status of that? They had that. And there was a little something here for everybody. And like you were saying, and like Mike was saying, anybody who attended this got their money's worth tenfold, probably. It was easily worth double what they were charging for this. And I hope more people check it out and still attend the summit. Well, you can't attend it anymore, but go ahead and watch it and check it out. And it was an awesome event. And I really hope they do this again because they made so much progress on this thing and got so many people involved in so many different aspects of things. It was tremendous. Just an awesome event. Hope I did it justice with the summary of what was going on in that. Anybody who listens along, or if you read the notes when it's done, you'll find the panels that really speak to you. Like Mike was saying, no matter your view, some of this may not resonate with you, and that's fine. That's okay. All of it was interesting to me, but some of that may be different for you. But hopefully what I discussed here may enable you to zero in and say, this is what I want to watch. This is the panel I'm most interested in. This is what I really care about. But I think the big thing is one of the big takeaways, and then I'll shut up about this and move to the last thing I want to talk about, is with the exception of the awkwardness between Cecilia and Beatrice in that one panel, there was such a sense of collaboration and camaraderie and just community in this event, which is so difficult with the UAP topic lately. The last few months have been a lot of infighting, backstabbing. Nobody's on the same page. And this was virtually none of that. I mean, everybody, even people when they disagreed with each other, were respectful with each other. Nobody was calling anybody out. Nobody was calling anybody a name. There wasn't any ad hominem attacks or any of that kind of shit going on. It was a lot of people all agreeing that this is the way forward. The citizen science, citizen disclosure, this is going to lead the way. How do we get there? Let's talk about that. And it was a remarkable success on that front. And that's it for the UAP Summit. Now, I did promise you guys a little bit of a fun thing here. We did have the Super Bowl yesterday. And during the Super Bowl, we got the latest trailer for the upcoming Steven Spielberg film, Disclosure Day. And we're going to watch the newest trailer right now. And then we're going to check out a little something that Steven said about the trailer that got a little bit of UFO Twitter talking today. We won't spend a lot of time on here, but let's just show this something fun at the end of this thing. So here's the trailer that we got, the big game day trailer for Disclosure Day.
We're interrupting our coverage. There has been a threat to publicly release government material long shrouded in secrecy. Are they people?
No.
Do you think there could be others?
People have a right to know the truth.
What are you gonna do?
Full disclosure to the whole world, all at once.
If you do this, there's no undoing it.
There will be no other day like tomorrow.
So I've heard various things about that, but before I even get into that, let's go to the other clip I wanted to show you, which is Steven Spielberg and his comments on the latest Disclosure Day trailer.
I've always been fascinated with things that cannot be explained.
What is it?
You wouldn't believe me if I told you, so I'm gonna show you.
And I've made a lot of movies about things that cannot be explained, from sharks to saucers.
Do you think there could be others?
When I was just a little kid, I remember developing a real curiosity about the sky at night and what's happening up there.
People have a right to know the truth.
And also, not the possibility, but the guarantee that there is life off this planet.
People keep wondering, encountering the unknown.
People's questions about what is not only going on in our skies, but what is going on in our worlds, in our realities, has reached a critical mass.
They're coming! They're coming!
Of people's complete fascination with, are we alone or are we not alone?
They are starved for the truth.
And if someone knows we're not alone, why haven't we been told?
Full disclosure to the whole world, all at once.
If someone knows we're not alone, why haven't we been told? Which, of course, is the big question that everybody asks repeatedly. And it's asked again here. Thoughts about the trailer. I don't want to spend too much time because it's already over 2 hours that I've been doing this. And for you guys who've hung with me, and I know there's like quite a few of you over on X watching this thing. And Mike, thank you for hanging out with me, my friend. I really appreciate it. And I've heard various things about the new trailer. I've heard a few people say it was underwhelming compared to the original teaser. Maybe. It is a Super Bowl spot. They can be hit and miss because they only cost $1 million a second. So, maybe we're not going to spend 2 minutes on this sort of thing. But, I think you get to see the craft for the first time. And I've seen multiple people, even some hardcore skeptics have made the comment that looks like the ship coming through the clouds in Independence Day. And when the mothership, not the mothership, but the big ship first arrives over the cities. I'm more concerned with Steven's comments, and that sort of thing. And, and I mentioned, I think I posted, Andy had posted the Stephen King, or not Stephen King, Steven Spielberg comments. And I'd said, part of me wants to say that this feels like more than just movie promotion. The bigger part of me says, no, he's just promoting the movie. I think the latter part is probably more accurate, but I don't know. I mean, he's always been very interested in this sort of thing. And he is stating some facts. There has never been, more of a interest. And Mike say the movie keeps getting weirder for me. The Kansas angle and quotes from real life. I've heard once you do this, it cannot be undone. Remember, happy ending does not just mean you get answers. No. I don't know if there is a happy ending for this story. You got hybrids, you've got stuff going on, you've got secrecy, you've got who knows what's happening in this whole thing. But it's certainly going to be a day one movie for many of us. It does seem, I agree with Mike, it does seem to be going into some weird places. But I'm okay with that. I like stuff that gets a little bit weird. I don't want this stuff like cookie cutter fed to me, that sort of thing. That's no fun. Give me something that's going to make me think. That was one of the things I loved about the summit. So much of what I heard made me think and contemplate things. And for somebody like me and I'm not trying to brag or anything like that, but I'm pretty cerebral as far as my approach to a lot of things. It's just the way I am. So anything that's going to challenge me to think a certain way, I'm like, yes, bring it on. I don't want this to be completely easy. Give me something thought-provoking. This movie looks like it's going to be that. Whether Steven Spielberg is trying to tip his hand to something or whether it is just straight up movie promotion, make up your own mind. We're going to find out a lot more in 6 months. But I like the trailer. I think, they didn't break any new ground other than the appearance of the ship. I don't think we saw anything in that trailer that wasn't already alluded to in the first one. And that's okay. That's okay. These are all teasers. And, let's see when we get closer. We're still 4 months away. Chances are we're going to get an air quoting official trailer. They do this, teasers, and then you get the official trailer. What will that official trailer really look like? If they're going to go that route, that'll be the big question. But I did want to show that with you guys. I promised you, after all that heaviness of the UAP Summit, I want to have something fun at the end. So there you go. The latest stuff from Disclosure Day and the latest from the man himself, Steven Spielberg, planting the seeds. You got to say, whatever he's doing, he's planting some seeds there. Whether they're going to sprout into anything, I guess we will wait and see. But that's going to do it for this episode of Unidentified History, guys. Thank you so much for coming in here and watching this with me. And I hope I did you guys justice with the recap of the UAP Summit. I know that was very detailed. I really hope that what I said does help direct you as to the panels that we discussed that piques your interest. Because that's what I really wanted to do here, not just a rote regurgitation of everything. I wanted to give the highlights, and hopefully that was going to get you guys interested and say, this is what I want to watch. This I'm not so interested in, but this I really care about. And of course, the Disclosure Day. If you want to follow me on social media, if you want to email me, you can email me at attitudeofaggression@gmail.com. You can follow me on X at attitudeag, that is at attitudeag. Go to the website, attitudeofaggression.com, especially if you're interested in this episode and you want the notes that I compiled for the UAP Summit for your own, whatever you want to do with them. They will be on the website as a free download once the episode goes live, which will probably be in the next day or two. But like I said at the outset, it's yours, guys. Download it, do whatever you want with it. I don't care. I'm not in this for credit or adulation. I'm just trying to help. And pass out some information. But the website, attitudeofaggression.com. Make sure you check out the YouTube channel, like, subscribe, share, comment, all that fun stuff. The Attitude of Aggression's YouTube channel. We are on Instagram and on Facebook as well, but I'm not nearly as active over there. But that is going to do it for this episode of Unidentified History. Yes, last comment from Mike. Absolutely. Thank you for coming on, Mike. Thank you for spending this time with me. It is always great to have you here and to interact with you, my friend. And I agree with Mike. Check out the UAP Summit. It is well worth your time and your money. It's a good time. Until next time, guys, stay vigilant, stay diligent, stay observant. That might be my new catch line here. I kind of like that. That's not bad for off the top of my head. But that's going to do it for this episode. We will be coming back. I know I keep saying this. The Kenneth Arnold sighting is coming up. I promise you guys we're doing that. That's coming soon. But until then, everybody take care. Stay safe out there. And we will catch you soon for more Unidentified History.